You guys know me as Matt Barnes. I also sometimes go by the name of Morpheus, the Morpheus of education. If any Matrix fans out there, I consider myself a liberator of parents and learners, and this conversation is right up my alley. I also am a friend of misfit families, and these are families whose kids don't quite fit the traditional system, whose family doesn't quite fit the traditional educational system, and I help families find a better fit. And so today I'm going to make a case, kind of the why, the how, and the what that parents can do to transition their kids from the traditional model of education to more of a self-directed learning model. We'll discuss that. We can talk about what that means. If you have questions, I want to leave a lot of time for questions, and so feel free to interrupt at any time to ask me questions. We'll also talk a little bit about the why nots, why making this transition may not be the right call for everybody. And again, I don't believe that there is a right call, one right call for everyone. I believe there's so many calls that it's too numerous to even go into. So before we get into hacking education, let's get familiar a little bit with GatherTown. I know some of y'all have been here before, but I'm going to do a couple of polls. And the way that I'll run the poll is I'm going to ask you to vote with your feet, something that's not possible on other formats. And so below the stage, you might see it on the right side of the stage, it says strongly agree. On the left side, it says strongly disagree. And so for the next minute or two, I'm going to read a statement and ask you to move your avatar to where on that continuum you feel that you are. Does that make sense? The first question is, school prepares kids for adulthood. School prepares kids for adulthood. And so I want you to line up according to where on that continuum you feel that you are. Okay, so mostly disagree. At least it sounds like you strongly disagree. Okay, here's the next question. A college credential means that a child is workforce ready. Okay, at least I see you moving to the right a little bit, so you're still on the disagree area. Beth, you're on the strongly disagree. Okay. And the third question I'm going to ask is, I'll ask you to go to the far right if you believe that college teaches kids to know things, and the far left if you think college teaches kids to do things or how to do things. So know things on the right, do things on the left. Okay, Lisa, you're kind of in the middle. Beth, you're mostly towards know things. Now, of course, these questions depend on the individual child and their circumstance, right? But generally speaking, what I heard from you and what I heard from almost every person that I talked to is that schools are really focused on something other than preparing a child for adulthood, focused on something else other than really getting a child workforce ready. They want the credential, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the person is workforce ready. And then there's a real emphasis on knowing things, not necessarily doing things. And again, it depends on the program you're in, but generally speaking, you all agree with those kind of framings. So given that, now getting back to the presentation, what I'd like to do is to kind of give a little bit of a history lesson. You guys may know some of this already, but for those of you who may be a little bit new to this game, I talk about life before 1950, and you can maximize my screen now again if you'd like to see it larger. Before 1950, pathways to adulthood were pretty clear. There were trades, there was, of course, there's nepotism, there's family businesses, there's farming, right? And then came the season of what I call the stable pathway. And that's the idea that the college degree, more or less during that period of time, became the pathway to stability and a middle-class life. And I graduated in 1989, so I'm giving my age here. And I tell a story about how I was an excellent artist. And my high school counselor told me that I needed to drop my art classes and to double up on my math classes, because if I was going to go to college, I would have to have a certain number of math courses, etc. And so the thing that I was really good at, the thing that I love to do, and frankly, the thing I've done for the 30 years since graduating, was the thing that they told me to get rid of because they were trying to get me on the college path. That's the stable pathway mindset, right? Now, I also want to remind everyone that we are about to enter, or we are entering, what some call the fourth industrial revolution. Have you heard that term before? Yeah. And so that's the idea that now everything's changing, right? We have artificial intelligence coming online. We have autonomous vehicles. We have a decentralized everything, a distributed everything. We have biotech that's becoming incredibly powerful, right? These are all the things that are transforming how life is going to work. And so that stable pathway is really breaking down. So what I'm trying to do right now is to actually make a little bit of the case of the why. As we think about what happened in the past, it no longer really applies, certainly to the degree that it did when we were coming up. And so as we think about what our kids and why we need to think about making a transition, it's really because the world is transitioning around us. And if we stay kind of where we have always been, then we will be disrupted like everything else is being disrupted. I talk about it like the Blockbuster Video story, right? Now, the next part of this conversation is about how do we make that transition? And so we make the transition by getting as much clarity as we can about what the future is going to require of young people. Now, the World Economic Forum, they release a report every couple of years, and the last report on the future of work talks about in the next few years, over a third of skills that are now considered important will have changed. So there's going to be dramatic reskilling the world over. In the near future, because of this fourth industrial revolution, again, advanced robotics, autonomous transportation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, et cetera, genomics, all these things are really striking at the core of what does it mean to work. And so it's transforming how we think, what we're going to do. And I will ask you all this question. Does anyone think that were it not for COVID, that we would be having a conversation like this, people in different parts of the world, I'm standing in my attic and we're having a conversation. Would that have happened if it were not for COVID? I don't see any, there's me being somewhat of a Luddite. I don't think there's any possible way that I would have been, thrust into the 21st century like I have been. And so my point is that everything is changing around us. Jobs are going to disappear. The function of work, the location of work is changing. And so to be successful in the future, the one thing that is clear, and it should be abundantly clear, is that our kids are going to need a different set of skills. And so again, enter Stephen Covey. Begin with the end in mind. I'm going to ask you all to help me here. What skills, characteristics, or abilities are going to be needed in the future, let's say in 2033? What skills will a child need in 2033? Exactly. What I heard was resilience, flexibility, the soft skills that are both interpersonal and intrapersonal, and this reality that despite the amount of technology that's coming online, we still have to connect as humans. We still have to interact. We still have to know how to treat one another. So these are skills that we can reasonably assume are going to be true from this point into this fourth generation or fourth industrial revolution. What I heard were things that were highly in alignment with the World Economic Forum, who says that critical thinking and problem solving are two of the top skills that our employers believe are going to grow in prominence. But then the one that I think we just touched on is this emerging set of skills called self-management, or I like to call that as self-governance or self-leadership. It's the ability for me as an individual to operate as my own unit as I interact with the larger world, not waiting for someone to tell me what to do, but knowing how to do things on my own. So, and if you think about it, if work is moving remotely, if we're able to have conversations like this with some regularity, if you're given a responsibility to solve a problem, you've got to be able to self-manage and constantly in a constantly changing environment. So you've got to constantly learn. So learnability, all that stuff, right? So here's the summary slide. So the World Economic Forum says constant reskilling is one. Again, they're anticipating 50% of employees are going to need to reskill by 2025. That's pretty crazy. The box below it, the top growing skills of, again, critical thinking, problem solving, And then this thing that I call becoming MacGyver. Do you guys remember MacGyver? Right? The guy who could, fix a car engine with, chapstick and some aluminum foil, right? He could do it all. He always knew how to solve problems. And in fact, the little tagline there on the slide is always prepared for adventure. That is what every young person is going to need to become. They're going to need to become a mini MacGyver. And this idea of learning independence or self-governance or self-management, all of these things are common skills that historically have not been taught, and they're going to increasingly be required. So if we want to build self-managers, self-governors, independent learners, how do we do that? And before I talk about the how, I'm going to talk a little bit about the two self-managers that I see in my household every day, and give you a little sense of what their life looks like. If you guys read my blog posts, you might know some of this already. But I've got one daughter, two of my MacGyver girls. And by the way, I expected them to join me today, but one got tickets to a play and the other one is out, living her life. So, bear with me. So my oldest, 17 years old, she just finished publishing her book in December at the age of 17. She's doing a paid internship right now in marketing and PR with a consulting company. When she was 14 or 15, she quit a selective high school, I do selective in quotes, high school. After her freshman year, she had a 4.0 GPA. She loved the social aspects of school, but she hated the download speed, right? She knew she could learn faster. She knew she wanted to learn deeper, particularly in the areas of interest to her. And once she left, she was off to the races. So my youngest, in the last 12 months, she just turned 16, and she's a paid consultant in communications, earning $14 an hour and rising. She's taking courses at a university. She's learning how to fly. She did her first professional play in January, 20 different performances over the course of a month. Did an internship at a theater company, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these things they did on their own. I did not play a role other than a coaching role at helping them to move forward. Right? That is what I call a self-manager. And again, I'll ask the question, how does someone learn to manage themselves? I'll answer it for you so we can move forward. You practice. That's how you get better at anything. You practice it, right? So, learning independence. This is my overly dramatic slide here. How and the what. The first is this how of practice. There is a circular arrow there that describes the virtuous cycle of goal setting, planning, execution, and evaluation. This is what every high-functioning adult does, correct? If I were to ask you, did you go to the grocery store in the last week or two, you would tell me. And I would say, what was your goal? Well, to get these things. Maybe you had a list. Maybe you had a mental list. What was your plan? I'm going to go at this time to avoid the long lines and to use these coupons maybe. What was your execution strategy? I schedule it, put it in my calendar. How do you evaluate it? Oh, I hated the lines that showed up at that time. I'm going to go in a different time. Those are all elements of a virtuous learning cycle that young people never get a chance to practice. Here's why. If they're in a traditional school, the school sets the goals for the child. The school develops the learning plan. The school then gives the child a very narrow artificial band for execution, right? You can test during this time. It's got to be done in an hour. You can't use the internet. You can't talk to your friends or collaborate on it, right? Very artificial. And then the school evaluates the child. So at no point does the child ever get to go, okay, what do I want to learn about? Okay, how do I develop a plan to learn about that thing? Okay, boy, I'm not very good at executing, but I'm going to do my best. And boy, I realized I need to practice this more because I wasn't very good. So now the whole process repeats. That is the virtuous learning cycle that is absent. And I'll go further. I will make a statement here that some may object to. And it is this, that the major difference between kids today and kids from before 1950 is that back then, kids were forced by the very nature of their lives to constantly problem solve. And kids don't have it, and it's not their fault. It's because we as adults never give them the opportunity to do so, or rarely do we give that to them. So if we want a young person to become a self-manager, then we have to help them practice that. Is this making sense? Any questions, or want to pause? Because I'm about to go into an example of how to do that in more specifics. The aim now is to develop this virtuous learning cycle in every child, and it is really hard to do. But here is what I found to be one of the most effective ways to start to inspire that, and it is called mission map. What is a mission map? It's the virtuous cycle we just described, and it is a cycle that starts by asking the child what they are interested in. And so here, these 5 steps are exactly how it operates. I can go into more detail if you'd like, but you start by asking the child to really brainstorming with the child about one thing that they'd like to do, become, or fix in the world, or in their community, or in their home. And then you, as the learning coach, you would work with them to pick one and insert that into that goal cycle of goal setting, planning, execution, evaluation, repeat. Then step 3 is, and this is super, super important, you help that child to develop a 5-minute plan, a 15-minute execution plan, and a 24-hour plan. And the reason we do that is because most kids will say, I want to, they may make something up. I want to be let's say professional basketball player, right? That's what I want to do. Fine. What's the 5-minute plan to do that? Well, I want try out for the Rockets, right? That's not a 5-minute plan. So we have to narrow the child down into 5-minute plan might be shoot 10 baskets, right? That could be the plan. But again, the key here is that we are trying to start this cycle spinning. Does that make sense? And once that cycle starts to spin, it will generate its own momentum. So continuing on here, once you go through that 5, 15, 24-hour plan, now you say, okay, child, it's your time to execute on this. You want to be standing side next to them as they go through that process of execution. You don't want to browbeat them. You don't want to remind them over and over again, hey, did you do the 5-minute, did you do the 15-minute? But you do want to set up the next check-in. Check in with the child to make sure that they understand where the barriers were for their own progress. Does that make sense? And the key here is no shame, no blame assessment and restarting. What I have found, having done this with dozens of folks, is there's couple different personalities. Some kids will take this and they will aim for the stars and they will try to get there tomorrow, right? So for those kids, you have to actually, part of the evaluation is letting them know, hey, it looks like you aimed really high. That's great. But aiming too high can actually lead to discouragement, right? Other kids will say, I don't know what I want to do. I don't know, right? And for those kids, now the mission map actually becomes the mission map is actually to figure out what are some things that you actually do like to do, right? Or would like to become, or would like to fix in the world. Let me pause there and ask for feedback or thoughts or reaction to the mission map. Some of this is developmental. So I'm assuming the child is probably in their 12 to 14 range. If the child is younger, 5 minutes, 15 minutes, and 24 hours, it may be actually too long. The point here is that what's the most likely thing to happen once a child develops a plan? And that is that they will forget it, right? And so by having these fairly short increments, you're trying to kind of keep that plan front and center in their mind. And when they do forget, that becomes the evaluation process. What happened? How did you forget? Oh, I don't know. I just forgot. Well, what are some ways that we can, in our next plan, make sure that you might have a better chance of remembering, right? And so the cycle has to be short initially because eventually, as they get better at this, they can start to look at weeks and months and years, which is what high functioning adults do. We can think about years into the future, but initially you got to think really, really short. So the cycle is the key we're after here. So, and the reason we ask the child to develop something that they want to do or they want to become or something that they want to fix is because by them coming up with that goal, two things. One, they become more motivated towards it. And two, they start to realize that they have personal agency. They can actually decide to do things on their own. And it's going to be difficult. So the key point, though, about this whole process, and I'm going to remind everybody on number 5, which is no shame, no blame, evaluation, and restart. No shame, no blame, evaluation, and restart. What happened? Oh, you forgot? What do you think happened there? Because I forget stuff all the time. Would you like to know what I do when I forget things? I write them down on a sticky note. I put them in my phone. I set an alarm. I mean, that is the process. And again, the key here is to grow self-managing, self-driven, autonomous learners. And this is, in my experience, the most important first step to that. Okay, let's continue on. Thanks for the questions. Let's go to the next. So I went through a little bit of the how with the cycle, and this was the what. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to talk about how. And here is a graphic that I have seen this play out literally 1,000 times. This to me is, if I die tomorrow, please have this put on my gravestone. Okay, this is what I call the learning independence curve. And let me describe it for you real quick. And again, if the future requires self-management, then this curve is actually how that happens. When the child is born, any child, the parent has ownership of that child. They essentially decide when that child is going to be changed. They decide when the child is going to be fed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But immediately, ideally, that parent begins to teach the child that they can begin to make choices for themselves. So that first column there, I call that the control column, where the parent is really in a position of control. Not a negative, but you want to keep the child safe. You want to keep them fed. The child's unable really to know some of the things that you may want them to know. So that's a control environment. But the next column, I describe it as a parent-led negotiation column. And that can happen very quickly. And frankly, it should. So this is where the parent says, or the teacher, or whoever says, would you like to read this book or this book? Right? Would you like to wear this pair of shoes or this pair of shoes? Would you like to go to the park or go on a walk in the neighborhood? Right? Those are parent-led negotiations that are occurring. The third column is when the learner now becomes the lead negotiator. Quick story. One of the parents I worked with, their 14-year-old daughter came to her mother and said, Mom, I would like to go to, I think it was Panama, the country of Panama. And this was a parent who I think lived in Wisconsin. I want to go to the country of Panama for a month. And I can't even remember what she was doing there, something in the forest or jungle or something. And now, ordinarily, a parent would say, heck no way I'm going to even consider it. But this parent had been training this child. And so when the question came up, the parent said, let's negotiate that. I need to know who you're going to be with. I need to know absolute certain that you're safe. I need to be able to either hand you off or, have someone else go with you, right? They entered into a negotiation. Long story short, the child ended up going, was there for a month. And the child, by the way, satisfied every concern that the parent had in that negotiation. Child came back with wonderful experience, a great learning experience, a great empowering experience for that child. Now, I'm not suggesting that every 14-year-old should be allowed to go to another country, but I'm saying the process of letting the child begin a negotiation is actually what I'm arguing here. And then the last column is what I call freedom. And this is what every parent wants, what every teacher wants. They want to know that their child, the child that they're pouring into, is going to be okay, that they're going to be able to navigate a rapidly changing world without without getting stuck. And that's, again, when I work with parents, it's what they want more than college. It's what they want more than their child to have a great career. They want their child to be stable, safe, and able to navigate a constantly changing world. That is true freedom in my view. So that is the high level of this description, and I can talk about how this gets tricked up and becomes problems at times. So let me pause, get your reaction to what I just described. Well, and Beth, what I love it. I love it. What most, and you get it, but what most environments that I've seen is that the value of letting the child learn that they can actually develop their own goals, their own plan, with the support, right? Everybody needs a coach, with execute and evaluate themselves. That is exactly the type of self-manager that the World Economic Forum is saying is going to be in high demand going forward. That is wonderful, Beth, and unfortunately it is also rare. Let me mention one thing here that is really important. This is super hard. So when I talk about the why not, this is the same graphic and shows you some problems that can happen. There's a bunch of different ways this can go sideways. One is that the school, when the school steps in, the school starts to take over the responsibility of telling the child what to do, and the child can also sometimes, you see that little pink line, the child can sometimes atrophy, stop learning that they can actually lead and make decisions for themselves. And that leads to a real problem later on when the child is now going to be expected to make adult decisions, but they've really never been given adult freedom to do so. That's really, really dangerous. Other things that happen, I've seen this happen too, where the parent turns the ball over too quickly to the child. And you've got a child who now is 6 years old and they really have run of the house and they put themselves in danger. So there are some balancing elements here. Likewise, and this is where I usually failed, still struggle with it, is where I become the tyrant parent for too long. This is what all tiger parents do, by the way. They become the decision maker. And I'm a recovering tiger parent, I'm sad to say. So for me, I was so overbearing that I was actually teaching my children to not try, not do, not lead. So those are some ways that this can get squirrely. But generally speaking, this graphic, I've seen it work and I've seen it not work, but it always is descriptive of what's going on within the family and life. So why not do this is because it's really hard. And it's a lot easier to just say, you know what, school, I'm going to give you responsibility for raising my kid and getting my kid ready for adult life. That's a lot easier. But the outcomes speak for themselves if you look at the data around young people preparedness for adult life. All right, let's move on. Any other questions, just let me know. Again, here's kind of the summary of the command and control, parent-led negotiation, learner-led negotiation, and then this idea of influence and coaching during the time of freedom. So let's talk about that, Lisa, because that actually relates to this. The role of the parent has shifted, and no parent has really realized that it's gone on. And the shifting has been from one of where heavy management during that period of time where the pathway was secure and stable, right? Heavy management is actually encouraged during that environment because if your child gets off of the conveyor belt, they're in trouble. Does that make sense? So the tiger parent actually can do very, very well in that environment. But the world has shifted on us. And so parents are still working in the old model. They're still afraid that my child's going to step off the conveyor belt. But what I'm arguing here is that when you want to develop a self-manager, you intentionally step off of the conveyor belt. And as a result, your job as a parent shifts from being the tiger controller to being the coach that walks alongside the child. And so what I have here on this graphic is my youngest daughter's learning whiteboard. And so for all the people I work with, we create a whiteboard and we begin to brainstorm, and it stays on the whiteboard. The things they're interested in, the plans, the things that kind of got, that went astray, what they learned, all that stuff stays here. It's because it's part of their learning journey. And so as the parent, the hardest thing has always been for me to just walk alongside and to not feel like I have to step in when I think my child's going to skin their knee. And of course, now if they're going to do something that is seriously damaging, of course you've got to step in. But the vast majority of activities are not nearly as dangerous as one might think. In fact, there's a woman who wrote a book. She grew up in Germany. I'm sorry, her family, she moved to Germany, had a family. They grew up in Germany, and then they moved back to the States. And the shock of coming back to the States and realizing that her kids, that people looked at her funny when she said, my kids are going down the street to the grocery store to get groceries, or they were going to go on the bus across town to the museum. People were horrified by this. And so she ended up doing this research and writing a book. She's one of the people I interviewed, but talked about how that shift is actually part of the problem of raising young people that don't have agency, that are actually somewhat afraid themselves. And again, working with a lot of parents, I completely understand what's going on up here. There's fear. There's a ton of fear. But what they don't tend to recognize is that there is a danger in keeping them from walking. The danger is that the young person starts to believe that they can't walk, right? That they're not capable of keeping themselves safe, that they're not capable of taking calculated and thoughtful risks. And in this future world, risk-taking, you talked about at the beginning, flexibility. That's an element of risk-taking. Sometimes things are going to work out, sometimes they're not, but I'm going to step forward into it. That is an essential skill. So the risk of doing nothing, or the risk of stopping your child from moving into an agency space, is actually now more dangerous than keeping them quote unquote safe. Your job is to start to recognize, and the reason I work with parents is because parents, if you have blind spots, you're going to now bring those onto your child. Just like you mentioned, Beth, if I am afraid of having my child walk around, I'm going to now make my child afraid. If I'm afraid of my child becoming a self-directed learner, I'm going to message to my child that you can't, you won't, that's dangerous, etc. We now, parents, have to do the work themselves, or teachers. But again, with teachers, it's harder because they're in a system oftentimes that doesn't give them a lot of freedom. So that's why I work with parents. Here's another. This was like one of the early brainstorming. I'm not sure if you can make that out, but essentially we categorized it. We, all the things you possibly could be interested in. She just put her on a board, and we began to decide, okay, which ones are we going to start to develop plans about first, second, third. And we would check in about it, and we would not make progress. Well, what did we learn, etc. It's a constant process, and now it's so freeing for me because I can watch her set a target and know that she's going to make progress on it without me. And that is, again, the freedom that I want every parent to be able to have. So with that, let me go ahead and stop. That's probably enough. We're coming up close to the end of the hour. What did I miss? What questions do you still have? One of the other strategies around learning coaching is exactly what just happened artificial or accidentally, which is you build your coaching staff, right? So Lisa now becomes one of your assistant coaches, and Beth becomes one of your assistant coaches potentially, right? And you guys learn from each other, and maybe tag team. Maybe there's some opportunities to explore things together. That is one of the other real missing elements of our society now. We live in almost complete isolation, and as a result, we don't have the system of supports around our families that we once had. And so we have to actually be really intentional about recreating that. And so I'm really glad. I hope that the two of you all are able to connect outside of this. And if I could ask one thing from you all, if this was valuable, could you take a screenshot and just post it and just say this was a valuable conversation? And if it wasn't valuable, then don't screenshot it and don't tell people that it wasn't valuable. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all very much and have a great morning and great night.